Thanks, Sherry. Thanks very much for inviting me. And yes, a slight change of pace now. I am indeed your pet evolutionary biologist. And I'm interested in the evolution of brains and behavior in particular. And I kind of see brains like exotic fruits growing on the tree of life. And my work's aimed at trying to understand how and why we see this diversity, how this diversification came about. And that diversity, of course, includes the human brain. I hope, so I'm going to be talking about rather different things than you've been hearing about, but I hope there's at least some kind of contact between the things that we've been discovering and the things that interest you. So in my talk today, I'm going to give you basically some snapshots of the work that we've been doing for the past 25 years or so, really, and explain how it's led me to the sorts of conclusions I've come to about the general nature of cognitive evolution and hence of cognition, which, as you will see from my title, I have a particular kind of view about. So I study the macroevolution of brain size and structure using phylogenetic comparative methods, which is a set of statistical tools for evaluating how biological traits have evolved across millions of years of evolution. Now, necessarily, this is extremely crude in neuroscience terms because in order to study traits across many, many species, you have to measure things, and that means using fairly crude measurements in order to get enough species to feed into the analysis. But hopefully we can still infer some interesting things about cognition. So how does this work? Broadly speaking, if you have information on many living species, for example, information about their brain size, the size of particular components, the numbers of neurons in particular brain structures. And if you also know how those species are related to each other phylogenetically, you can infer patterns and processes that are most likely to account for the diversity that we see today. If you can do that for one particular trait, you can do that for many traits and map that onto the phylogenetic tree and see how the traits have evolved in relation to each other, what we call correlated evolution. So we can use this approach to study the rates and patterns of evolution and correlated evolution between traits, such as between brain size and structure and behavior and so on. So here's an example from a paper we published in 2024 where we took another look at a whole variety of questions about the evolution of brain size across the mammalian tree. This is just an illustration of the phylogenetic approach. So here you see a phylogenetic tree of mammals, and we have data for a couple of thousand species of mammals. In this phylogenetic tree, the branches are coloured and scaled to reflect the inferred variation in the rates of evolution. So long, hot-coloured branches, we see very fast rates of evolution. And there's evidence that fast rates of evolution, accelerations in evolutionary change, reflect selection. So we see accelerated evolution scattered across the mammalian tree, which is quite interesting. There's certainly no constancy in the rate of evolution. There's a lot of variability. For example, in bats, we generally see very low rates of, and I should have said that this is relative brain size accounting for variation in body mass. So this variation is not due to body mass. We see very low rates of relative brain size evolution in bats, with a few exceptions. In primates, we don't really see much acceleration in rates at the origin of primates or in the lemurs and lorises. But in the anthropoid primates, the monkeys and apes, we start to see accelerating rates of brain size increase. And that accelerates even further in the apes, setting the scene for the dramatic evolutionary expansion of the human brain. And we've estimated that the expansion of the human brain occurred at a rate about 23 times the background rate for mammals. So there's some interesting things going on here. But of course, the question is, why? So why do some species have such large brains? And I've approached that by asking how large brains are specialized, which regions have expanded. This is a concept we have termed mosaic evolution, the idea that this doesn't mean that necessarily that a particular area will change relative to all other areas, but systems will tend to change relative to other systems. And how does this relate to natural behavior? This isn't my work, but just to take a step back for a moment, this is a nice figure from the book by George Streeter on brain evolution, and it depicts the brains of several species of fish. And what you can see is this idea of mosaic evolution very clearly, with different structures within the brains of these different species, being their relative size, reflecting the kinds of sensory motor specializations that they have. So, for example, in the goldfish explores its world in a gustatory way. It tastes its way around the place, and it has an expanded vagal lobe. The catfish has these barbels, which it uses for tactile sensing of its world in usually muddy environments where vision isn't much use, and so on. It has an expanded facial lobe, and then electrosensory fish like the glass knife fish have these enormous electrosensory lobes, and also very massive cerebellum, which is a structure I'll come back to. Now, generally, people assume that when we get phylogenetically closer to home and start to look at the primates, it's the cognitive parts that have expanded. This is really prevalent. It's a really sort of embedded idea that there are cognitive parts of the brain, there are special parts that have expanded, particularly that enable so-called higher or advanced cognition. The standard view of human brain evolution is that it's the neocortex, which is the intelligent bit of the brain, the structure that expanded most and that correlates with intelligent behavior across species. Pasco Rakic has referred to it as the crowning achievement of evolution and the biological substrate of human mental prowess. And it's thought to contain our representations of the world, essentially. And especially people have focused on the prefrontal cortex as kind of the seat of our rationality and executive control. On the other hand, areas considered to be primitive, more at the back of the brain, have stayed basically the same and come increasingly under executive control. And this idea of top-down control has an interesting cultural history, I think. I think it's a very Victorian view of the brain. So, for example, the neurologist Hewlings-Jackson, who came up with ideas about inhibition and disinhibition from observing his patients, had an explicitly social Darwinist take on how brains worked. And he said that the higher nervous arrangements evolved out of the lower to keep down those lower, just as a government evolved out of a nation controls as well as directs that nation. And this kind of idea has become very embedded in Western culture, and we've kind of got an obsession with top-down control. And it's reflected in MacLean's triune brain concept, which is really the idea that brains evolved like layers of an onion with successive layers, giving increasing kind of intelligence and rationality and executive control. So when you get to the neocortex, you have the rational brain, and it's the rational brain that enables us to keep our instincts in check and have inhibitory control. This is the idea, really, that chimpanzees might have built space rockets and gone to the moon if only they'd been able to control themselves. I'm kind of being light-hearted, but actually these ideas continue. And I mean, nobody says that they believe in the triune brain concept anymore. And yet the idea is still very embedded in a lot of thinking. It's not what the data are telling us. So, for example, we studied the evolution of frontal lobes, various measures of different sort of data sets on the size of frontal lobes, including data sets on prefrontal cortex. This is over 10 years ago now, about 13 years ago, and found no evidence whatsoever that human frontal regions, including prefrontal cortex, are disproportionately expanded relative to the rest of the brain. There's been some kickback against that, but my take on it is that people have been, it's interesting, this cultural history again, I think, predisposed to go through contortions to demonstrate that the prefrontal cortex is terribly big and terribly important. And I think, but more recently, there's been work by other groups, such as Roger Mar's group, who have a paper quite recently where they conclude that human unique connectivity profiles concentrated in temporal and parietal cortices have been the subject of evolutionary change, and that their results counter models that assign primacy to prefrontal cortex for human uniqueness. So the prefrontal cortex is just one of several interconnected cortical regions that have undergone evolutionary change. So the data don't support that kind of thinking. But also, I just think it's completely the wrong way to think about things. And I think it's worth taking a step back again and asking ourselves, what are brains for? Now, here I've got a contrast between humans and a very different species, the sea squirt. And this is a very famous kind of anecdote, which the neuroscientist Rodolfo Clenas originally expressed in his book. And so the human brain is very different to the brain of the sea squirt. But the sea squirt does something interesting. It has an interesting life cycle. So it has this motile phase where it swims around. It's like a little tadpole, and it swims around looking for a nice place to live. And to navigate its world, it has a simple central nervous system. It's got about 100 neurons in it and about 5 sensory receptors, until it finds a nice rock and goes head down onto the rock and becomes an adult. In the adult form, it is a sessile organism. It no longer is moving around. And Clenas famously observed that at this point it absorbs its own brain because it doesn't need one. If you're a sessile organism that doesn't need to move around, you don't need a brain. The human brain is, of course, considerably larger and more complicated, with about 90 billion neurons, each of which makes at least sort of 10,000 connections with other neurons, trillions and trillions of synapses organized into systems of staggering complexity. And yet, I would argue that essentially it has the same kind of function, and that is adaptive behavior via sensory motor control, notably. So brains evolved not to enable us to sit on a rock contemplating the mysteries of the universe and solving problems that way, but to enable us to move adaptively around in the world. I don't know if you know John Wyndham's book, The Day of the Triffids, or the film, The Day of the Triffids, where due to some cosmic event, the triffid plant is irradiated and mutates into this thing that uproots itself and starts to walk around and attack and consume humans. And you should always have at least one unfalsifiable prediction in a talk, and mine is that when science finally discovers the triffid, it will be, and dissects one, it will be found to have a central nervous system. But more seriously, motility and the presence of a brain of some sort have evolved repeatedly across the tree of life. There's a very close phylogenetic relationship between motility and having a brain. Now, what about primates? Well, primates are visual specialists. Just like fish, they have sensory motor specializations that are reflected in the structure and size of their brain. We and other primates have large frontally directed eyes that can do binocular integration of, or the brains do a binocular integration of stimuli based on convergence of signals from each eye in the cortex. In anthropoid primates in particular, we see the evolution of high acuity photic vision, daytime vision, and an area centralis, a fovea, with retinal magnification, which means that the processing signal from 1% of the retina occupies 50% of the cortex. And when we look at the brains, we see a complex arrangement of highly interconnected and numerous cortical visual areas, with visual areas making up more than half of the neocortex of macaques. And this isn't just classic visual cortex. There are many visual regions, but also major visual connections with supposedly non-visual regions. So this led me to think it would be interesting to see if there's some relationship between the evolution of large brains and the evolution of visual specializations. And this is exactly what we found. So here's just one example looking, this is accounting for variation in body mass. We find a strong relationship between the size of the brain and the volume of the optic nerve. And then we've done a whole series of analyses where we find relationships between brain size and orbital convergence or binocularity, optic nerve size I've talked about, the number of neurons in the primary visual cortex, the number of neurons in the parvocellular layers of the lateral geniculate nucleus, which is the pathway primarily mediating high acuity and color vision. There's a nice dissociation because we don't see that relationship for the magnocellular neurons. And when we look at behavioral measures of visual acuity, we also find that's related to brain size. And if we look at neocortex size, we also find these kinds of relationships. But there's no point having an excellent visual system. There's no homunculus sitting up there sort of pulling strings. You also have to connect that up directly to a motor system. And another thing that we found is that there's a very tight evolutionary relationship between the evolution of the neocortex and the cerebellum. So this is looking at it in terms of the relative number of neurons in the neocortex in relation to the number in the cerebellum. And this is accounting for variation in numbers of neurons in the rest of the brain. So this isn't just a general relationship that if you have a lot of neurons in one part of the brain, you have a lot in another. It's very specific to the corticocerebellar systems. And what we found is that anatomy quite closely predicts evolution. Now, I mentioned yesterday in one of the groups that the neocortex and cerebellum are massively interconnected with reciprocal loops connecting up with every major area of the cortex. And what we found is that the more highly connected the structures are, the more closely they evolve together. I won't go into details for lack of time about how we've shown that, but at quite a fine-grained level, connectional anatomy predicts correlated evolution. And that made a lot of sense to me, and because of that I was quite happy to leave things there. You know, that was a general principle that I liked, except we noticed something in the data that took us by surprise, which is when you get to the great apes, including humans, actually also the lesser ape, the apes in general, but this trend accelerates in the great apes. We see that they are an outlier in that evolutionary relationship between cerebellum and neocortex. So both of these structures underwent accelerating evolutionary expansion in the human lineage and the other apes. But the cerebellum increased at a rate faster than predicted from the general relationship with the cerebellum. So on the scatter plot, the regression on the right there, you see the rates of cerebellar increase relative to neocortex increases. And the colored dots and the colored relate to the colored branches, which is the ape. So you can see that they're outliers, they're significant outliers in this relationship. So, yeah, that was supposed to be animated. I'm just going to quickly come out of that and delete that because that's obscuring what I wanted to say. I didn't do my animation correctly. Never mind. So we calculated from this sort of bit of a back-of-the-envelope calculation that the human cerebellum's 31% larger than it would be if it followed that scaling relationship for other anthropoid primates, rather than showing this sort of deviation that all of the apes show. And again, we're able to calculate from this knowing about the numbers of neurons, or the density of neurons, that this is equivalent to adding about 16 billion extracerebellar neurons, which beautifully turns out to be almost exactly the same as the total number of neurons in the human neocortex. And if we rescaled things, the numbers of neurons in these structures to reflect this, we'd be walking around, you know, in terms of volumes, we'd be walking around looking like that, which would be rather uncomfortable. And presumably there are good biological reasons why we don't. So what are all those neurons doing? And I've become very interested in more recent views, maybe not so new now, because this has been going on for about 20 years, on cerebellar function. And of course, we know that the cerebellum is involved in motor control and sensory motor coordination, but also many other aspects of cognition. And there's now lots of evidence for roles in a wide range of cognitive processes. And in particular, I'm interested in the idea that it's particularly implicated in the organization and comprehension of sequences of behavior. And not only in organizing those, but understanding and making predictions from them, which, after all, how one things follow another is essentially the basis of causal understanding, causal reasoning and prediction. But also there's evidence now for the role of cerebellum in perceiving and comprehending social interaction sequences. So this is all very interesting, and if we look at great apes and the evolutionary story, I suspect that this may have all been kicked off by a shift in the pattern of locomotion, where you have a large-bodied arboreal species that has to locomote through the forest below branches. It can't just scamper along the top of the branches. It has to plan careful routes through the canopy along sort of thicker supports that are not going to break. So careful, slow climbing and route planning may have been what kicked this off. And then we see secondary adaptation for things like extractive foraging, the extraction of juicy food, nutritious food parts from less nutritious sort of plant defenses, hard husks and shells and that sort of thing, and also digging things up, and also making tools to get at nice food items. And Richard Byrne has argued that the way that great apes manage these sequences is essentially with some kind of syntactical ability. And this idea of syntax as evolving from more general control processes goes back a long way to at least Carl Lashley, who suggested that the serial ordering of complex action sequences was a key cognitive problem solved by humans, that it underlies technology, language, music, and other things, and that it was inherited from more basic features of motor planning and control. So I'm quite interested in that idea. We've actually been running a project in Durham's Institute of Advanced Study, an interdisciplinary project involving looking at things like dance and all sorts of fun stuff. And we have a conference next spring, supported by the Royal Society, on sequences, behavior and cognitive evolution. And these are looking at the idea that fluent, well-articulated sequences of adaptive, what we might think of as intelligent behavior, occur across the tree of life, but are probably mediated by very different sorts of mechanisms. So what I think our data don't particularly support are the standard approaches in cognitive evolution that suggest that species vary in the amount of some kind of capacity that we call intelligence. And that intelligence involves the capacity to construct representations, like theory of mind, and representations that serve episodic memory. That intelligence evolved convergently in different groups, and this is basically the end of the story. And it's given rise to, the idea of convergent evolution has given rise to the notion of crows as being feathered apes, which is very anthropocentric because nobody ever suggests that apes might be wingless crows, and I think that tells you something about the approach. People are asking, does the octopus, which seems to be an intelligent being, have a theory of mind? Which again, theory of mind is essentially an anthropocentric folk psychological concept that need have no bearing at all on octopus evolution. And finally, the standard view is that we can and should separate cognitive from sensory motor capacities to get at what really matters. So that's in contrast to the kinds of conclusions that we're suggesting here, that cognitive evolution is actually the elaboration of specialized distributed systems for embodied adaptive control, not increasing top-down control by a homunculus-like cortical executive. And I've developed that argument in a series of papers. So thinking, in terms of planning, creativity, language, and so on, evolved from and involves sensory motor interaction with the world. And going back to Rodolfo Clinas, he actually put this quite nicely. A reconstruction of possible movements and their possible consequences becomes, in fact, the substrate of thinking. So if we want to understand the intelligence of any organism, we need to firstly discard anthropocentric notions of advanced cognition based on ideas of sort of top-down executive control, and secondly incorporate rather than try to control for its distinctive ways of perceiving, exploring and learning about the world. I'll stop there. Am I taking questions?
Yes.
Or, okay.
So yesterday somebody mentioned that we need intelligence to successfully coordinate for social interaction.
Yeah.
You are saying exactly the opposite, right? It's like for sensory motor interactions with the physical world.
I'm not sure it's the opposite.
The previous speaker specifically says it's instead of this, these ideas are contradicting each other.
So what was the first idea that you were saying?
That it's like looking for food, or like I think what you call sensory interaction.
I mean, I would be astonished if sociality hadn't had some effect on brain evolution. We haven't found that Dunbar set of relationships when we've used bigger data sets and better methods. And there's been a bit of a to and fro about this. So, but I still think, the other thing that we've been finding is that we see different things happening at different points in evolution on different parts of the tree of life. And there's no reason to think there's one thing like sociality that explains it all. I think sociality will turn out to have been a part of the story and will have led to some kinds of specializations, but we don't really know what those are as yet.
I love your results. I mean, this is very consistent with what I work in computer vision and robotics, and I've been arguing this forever in the AI context. Maybe you're aware of what we call Moravec's paradox. So
yes.
Moravec's
yes.
paradox is exactly the statement in AI of basically the same phenomena, that way too much attention is paid to cognition and language compared to sensory motor capabilities, and the development of those have to be far more challenging than the early people in AI.
I agree with that, except I think that it's all cognition. So the state of the art of robotics is like, a robot that still can't water your plants without getting water all over the floor. But of course, they've defeated grandmasters at chess for, 30 years.
Exactly. So I wanted to ask a more specific question, which was the distinction between, let's say, locomotion and manipulation, in the sense that, at least from what I read, some part of the argument about the increasing human brain size from the splitting off from the other, apes is to do with that, after post-bipedalism, the development of the hands, tool making, brain size increasing, that line of that line of argument, which is that basically it's the development of tool use and hand manipulation that led to the expansion of the brain. Do you generally buy? What is your view on that kind of?
It was the slide I had to cut. Yeah, we've got a paper on this showing.
Do you buy that general approach?
I do, yeah. And we found a relationship between relative thumb length, which is relative to the second digit, which is a rough indicator of precision grip, and relative brain size. So we're trying to unpack all of this kind of thing at the moment. And that's true across all primates. And we were also able to do it with fossil hominins, or fossil humans, and find the same relationship there.
Thank you.
Like Jitendra, I'm also a vision guy, but you can't deny that humans are really good at language.
No, I can't deny that.
You
yeah.
speak to how much of this evolution in the recent human lineage is due to language specifically?
Well, I'm sure it's a lot to do with it. There's this idea that there's one sort of special network, the arcuate fasciculus, that massively expanded in humans. I think it's much more complex than that. I don't understand why those people aren't looking at the cerebellum, and there's lots of evidence for a role of the cerebellum in language. So what I'm saying is, there's kinds of things I'm talking about, I think, kicked off changes that made other changes, secondary adaptations that built on adaptations build on adaptations. And once you start to have a sophisticated sequencing ability, you can turn it to all sorts of things. And maybe language was one of those things that emerged out of that. But
I mean, speech is a motor act,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
It's also a sequence.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But as we have to do for all our locomotion and manipulation.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Please, somebody know.
Maybe simple. Does this correlation with the cerebellum also hold with the hippocampus? Because also a sequence processor, right?
We haven't, I'll be totally honest with you, we haven't looked at that.
Okay.
And there's so much we haven't done yet. So what's the evidence about you're referring to about hippocampus?
Like all
and-
navigation tasks are sequence
Yeah,
processor.
yeah.
And then there's an
yeah,
abstraction
yeah.
of that, but
Yeah.
people have shown that, you know, if you do abstract
So-
navigation, you also...
So, and is that saying that, you know, maybe the cognitive map idea is a bit misplaced because it's not, it's about a sequence of things rather than about
Right,
a
even,
map-like
you know,
representation.
people showing that there's like, if you navigate in like abstract
Yeah.
spaces of relationships
Yeah.
or something, you see that in the hippocampus
Yeah.
reflected, which is
Yeah.
like all abstract sequence
Yeah.
building. So I just was wondering if you see
Yeah,
some
no,
similar-
well, I don't know the
Okay.
answer. Yeah.
Let's do Daniel and then Alosha and then we'll go to...
So I have a question about kind of non-primate intelligence. So, you know, you mentioned birds and octopi. So I know, for example, you know, scrub jays, Californian scrub jays, you know, have some kind of theory of mind in the sense that, you know, they dig nuts, and if another crow is looking at them, they go back after and dig them out so the other crow won't steal it, and all sorts of... Do you see in other branches of evolution similar processes, like, you know, correlations between, you know, I don't know, do birds even have cerebellum? I don't know much about bird biology, but do you see the same kind of correlations?
So I don't know if we find those correlations there. I'm not particularly sympathetic to the theory of mind stuff at all.
Yeah, no,
but
they are intelligent. I mean, I think people...
They show complicated behaviours with, you know, complicated sequences of things. They seem to be able to make predictions in quite sophisticated ways. There is some evidence that tool-using crows have an expanded cerebellum, but bird brains are a bit different to mammalian brains, and I'm not going to say that like the same neural kind of changes underpin similar looking behaviours across the tree of life. It might be something completely different. So octopuses would be a case in point. It can't be the same because their brains evolved completely independently of vertebrate brains.
Last one.
So, stupid question, but you kind of set it up very nicely. So why didn't monkeys go to the moon?
I think that's one for coffee time.
All right, let's come back. Let's do it at 11:15. Let's take half an hour for coffee and come back. Okay?
Are you sure the answer is we did?
No, but why us and not, you know, not the other one?
No, no, we